issues.
No problem.
Okay, so welcome and Elise, thank you. Um, I'd like to thank the Simon Wiesenthal Center for giving me the opportunity to share my story. A special thanks to Elise and Tally Lester, who've been so supportive. I started working on this presentation months ago. It didn't take me very long to write it. Although this is my first speaking engagement talking about my family, I've known for a very long time what it is that I wanted to say. It's a difficult story. There's a lot of tragedy, and it's not wrapped up at the end with a pretty bow. And then something happened once the presentation was announced. I started hearing from people in my parents' lives, people I haven't been in touch with for a very long time, people who mean something to me, and people who loved my parents and my parents loved. They were sharing stories about how wonderful my parents were. When my parents died, it was like I saw everything that came before with a dark filter. When it happened, there was a shockwave of grief. Even in those first few days when I was sinking, I knew so many people were in pain. That meant that my parents mattered and that they made an impact on people. And then there's the matter of legacy. For people who know me and my parents, you know some of the story. But how do you tell this story without sensationalizing it? At the end of the day, we were just human beings who did the best we could. So before I begin my presentation, the one I did write months ago, I want to say thank you to the people who reached out, to the people that stood by me when my parents died, and who are still standing beside me. I'm frequently asked, why now? Why write a memoir now? Why start speaking about this now? And I actually don't have a great answer. All I can say is this is what happened, and it feels important to me that it be told. Thank you for listening. My mother, Rachel Hyams, born Rutger Greenspan, was the first and ultimately only child of Regina and Aaron Greenspan. She was born into Masha Mazowiecki, Poland. She was 2 years old when the war broke out. On November 2nd, 1942, the Gestapo soldiers began their rounds, banging on doors and shouting, "Allah Juden raus," in Yiddish, Polish, and German, all Jews outside. My mother was only 5 years old, but she said she remembered that morning. The hurting, men, women, the elderly, children lined up in rows in the streets. I don't know if she saw the slow and the sick being shot, if she heard the children screaming as they were separated from their parents. This Groundhog Day from hell had been happening since the Germans arrived and set up the Jewish ghetto. My mother and grandmother were in a group that was thrust towards the small church on Watnot Street. In the courtyard, the Gestapo inspected work permits of the Jewish residents and decided who would remain in the ghetto and who would be deported. Remaining in the ghetto was bad. Getting deported was worse. There was a gate at the back leading to the churchyard. If they made it through the gate, they would survive a while longer. If not, they would be sentenced to death, stuffed into cattle cars to Treblinka and gassed. Of course, my mother couldn't have known these details, but she must have sensed the terror all around her. They made it through the gate, the lucky few. Within days, the population of Jews in Tamashov was reduced from 7,000 to a few hundred. Soldiers directed my mother and grandmother to a corner of the ghetto where several large stacks sat like piles of rake leaves. I imagine that at first they couldn't make out the details of these strange masses. But as they got closer, the contents of each pile became more defined. They were looking at the personal belongings of friends, neighbors, family, people who would no longer need their things. Eyeglasses, shoes, shirts, stockings. They were ordered to sort through the jumbled remains. In 1943, my mother and her parents were sent to the labor camp at Starchowice, 70 miles southeast. My mother would travel each morning to the munitions factory with her mother. The younger children always stayed home, but for some reason, even though she was only 6 years old, she was allowed to travel with her mother and stay with her while she worked. Soon the selections began anew. Every day, trucks arrived to gather people who were sick or not meeting the work quota. They would not come back. By now, these imprisoned Jews began to take a more proactive approach to their survival. My grandfather was able to bribe an SS guard so he would be given a warning about the roundups. When the signal came, my mother and grandmother hid in an attic. The guards shot at the ceiling where they were hidden, but the bullets missed them. My grandfather's bribes also included deliberately not shooting at the corner of the attic where his family was hiding. It was all just a big show. News of the gas chambers had reached the camp. My mother overheard her parents whispering one night about taking poison. Her father had gotten access to a legal drug. Would death be better than what lay ahead? My pragmatic grandmother asked my grandfather, but who will poison Rutka? And because it would have to happen in that order, the plan was abandoned. By the time the camp closed, my mother was one of very few children from Tomashov who was still alive. In June 1944, Starchewicz closed. The remaining Jews were sent to the railroad platform. They knew what this meant. 2 trains waited, puffing steam, one for women and children. My grandfather lifted my mother into the cattle car of the first train. Hurry, he said. He saw a friend on the platform, told my grandmother he was going to join him, and they never saw him again. For a while, my grandmother believed that her husband was in a different section of the camp. Eventually, my grandmother found out that Aaron had died en route to Dachau. My mother was not told anything about her father's death until after the war, when her mother told her, "Your father never made it off the train." I was always told that he suffocated on the train, but I've since learned that there was another possible narrative about what happened to him. I've been told that someone on the train went berserk and a fight broke up. This man, who was from Tomashov, strangled my grandfather. I don't think my grandmother ever was told that version. I believe my mother found out when she was collaborating on the book Kinderlager by Milton Newsma about 3 little girls from Tomashov who all survived. If my mother knew, she never shared it with me. My mother and grandmother were inducted into Auschwitz in June 1944. Their hair was not shorn, and they were not given tattoos until a few months later. My mother speculated that the commanders, who were so focused on efficiency, may have felt that this was a wasted effort because they likely wouldn't be alive for very long. My mother was a bright, engaging child, and one of the capos, a prisoner appointed by the Germans as a supervisor, gave my mother extra rations because she said she resembled her favorite niece. My grandmother, like other young mothers at Auschwitz, became resourceful. She would go to the fence outside the kitchen and beg for food. Sometimes they would ignore her, but other times they would give her a rotten potato. The children's rations consisted of coarse or sandwich-type white bread. If a child got ill and couldn't eat the coarse bread, my grandmother would take the soft white bread away from my mother and give it to the sick child. Even when they were completely dehumanized, acts of kindness and heroism persisted. Extra food rations were always shared. My grandmother and mother stayed in the same barracks until my mother was moved to the Kinderlager. When they came to get my grandmother started screaming. When my mother looked back, they were clubbing her mother in the head. My mother received her tattoo, A27632, in August 1944. She was 7 years old. She remembered that it hurt and that her arm blew up and there was swelling over the number. It was from that tattoo on her left arm that I learned my mother was in the Holocaust. I must have been around 6 or 7 years old when I asked her about it, essentially the same age as when she got it. She never kept it hidden. While there was an element of luck to their survival, the Russian front was advancing and the German infrastructure was breaking down. There were episodes which will never be explained. One day, the SS guards came into my mother's barracks and instructed all the children to undress and enter a building. And then nothing happened. They were instructed to go back to their barracks. At one point, my grandmother either was sick or feigned illness and was admitted to the hospital barracks. Now my mother and grandmother were in the same area across the road from each other, no longer separated by an electric fence. And then came the order: Auschwitz was to be evacuated. On what was to be my grandmother's final visit, she came to tell my mother that they would be going on a march. It was bitterly cold, and my mother had no warm clothes or shoes. My grandmother decided that if they were going to die, that there was no reason not to stay where they were. They hid under a bunk bed and covered themselves with blankets. Everyone else left the barracks. Total silence. And then they heard shouting. They assumed the Germans had returned, which was obviously very bad. But the apparitions, as my mother referred to them, spoke Russian and were followed by mobile soup kitchens. On January 27th, 1945, my mother and grandmother were liberated. They were free, but they had nowhere to go. They remained in Auschwitz, until Noah Greenspan, one of Aaron's younger brothers, one of 3 out of 11 siblings who survived, came to get them. They went back to Tomashaw, but they knew they had to get out of Poland. Noah, a mechanic, got his hands on a green convertible they called the Frog, which he repaired. Noah, his new wife, my mother and grandmother drove 300 miles to a border where Noah bribed a guard at the waterway between Poland and Germany to cross over in a rubber raft. They camped in the woods that first night and my grandmother stumbled and broke her arm. It couldn't be set for a few days until they reached Berlin. They eventually ended up in Feldafing, a displaced persons camp near Munich, where they stayed for almost 3 years. There, my grandmother met and married Jack Simberg. She didn't tell my mother until after they were married. My mother was used to being the center of my grandmother's world, and she had no interest in this new arrangement and would initially only refer to him as Mr. Simberg. My mother often told me that she was not happy that my grandmother remarried. Over time, my mother became very close with her stepfather, who was very loving to both her and her mother. Jack's life had also been decimated by the war. He survived Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, but lost his wife and 2 children. A tailor by trade, he heard that there was a demand for his profession in Montreal. So the 3 of them boarded a ship in Hamburg, arrived in Halifax, and traveled to Montreal to try to piece a life together. My mother was enrolled in a Jewish private day school, which was free for refugees. She only spoke Polish, she didn't wear her hair the same way, and she didn't dress like the other children. I think that she figured out pretty soon that looking like you fit in was half the battle. Dressing well became very important to my mother. By extension, dressing me well also became very important. She was 11 years old when she arrived in Montreal. She was put into grade 1. They had to bring in a bigger desk for her because she couldn't fit into the tiny desk that the other students used. By the time she went to high school 3 years later, she had completed 7 grades and spoke English, French, Hebrew, and Yiddish. She was athletic and became a star of the basketball team. She broke her nose when she was hit in the face by a basketball. She always had a bump on her nose because it was never fixed, but my mother was still beautiful. My mother hated the word survivor. It was not how she wanted to be defined. She felt surviving was an accident, not a virtue. She would say her childhood wasn't that bad, that she felt loved and safe, that lots of people had tougher childhoods than her. And I'll just draw your attention to this picture because you can say it's all adults and 1 child, my mother. She was basically just the only child with an environment just of adults. To me, survivor is a misnomer. Surviving is considered the ultimate victory when in fact, it's just the beginning of a lifelong battle. When I peeked into her bedroom during those long daytime naps, I saw that she slept with her arm over her eyes like she was still blocking out some slideshow of horror. If you're born into a family that isn't fatalistic, maybe you actually believe that once the worst has happened, then the worst is over and you're safe. But my mother knew different. Something worse than the worst was always possible. Black clouds are always speeding across the horizon straight towards you. Safety is not a given. In fact, it's a lie. My mother became a nurse and worked at the Jewish General Hospital. She was 20 years old when she met my father, Bram, who was doing his surgical residency at the same hospital. They had a mutual friend, Max Palu, who became my Uncle Max, and I know my Aunt Eunice is on this Zoom as well. Another doctor at the hospital who told my father to be on the lookout for this spunky athletic nurse. One night, my mother was working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. She was prepping a patient for emergency surgery, but she had gotten sunstroke from being out on a date in a boat earlier in the day and had a horrible headache. The date was not with my father. Being allergic to aspirin, she called the emergency department to ask for codeine. Because it was a narcotic, it had to be approved by the resident on duty, which turned out to be my father. They went out on a few dates, but my mother wasn't interested in a serious relationship, and my father was moving to Des Moines, Iowa to continue his surgical training. My father asked my mother to attend a hospital ball, and everything changed. It was winter in Montreal, and my father dropped my mother off at home one day after work. He drove 2 blocks, and his car totally died. He walked back to the home where my mother shared with her family, and she was already in bed. He sat down on the edge of her bed and asked her, "Would you come to Iowa with me?" To which she responded, "Would you marry me?" He replied, "You're not supposed to ask me. I'm supposed to ask you. Will you marry me?" That was February 13th. They had only been dating for 6 weeks. They got married on June 10th, and off they went to Iowa. While they were living in Des Moines, Jack died of a massive coronary in 1961 at age 57. At age 47, my grandmother had already been twice widowed. Her parents, first husband, and siblings had all died in the Holocaust. What I've come to understand is that only extraordinary people make it through that much trauma and somehow manage not to be destroyed by it. And my grandmother was one of those extraordinary people. My father's father, Ben, the first Jewish Orthodox in Montreal, also died of a massive coronary in 1961. He was 63. My parents moved back to Montreal. My father was now a surgeon and my mother stopped working. When my mother was pregnant with me, they discovered a mass in her stomach. They couldn't determine if it was malignant or benign. So my parents were given a choice: surgery now and lose the baby, or wait until the baby was born and have surgery then. They decided to wait. How terrifying it must have been for them to be experiencing the joy of a first baby and a potentially life-threatening issue at the same time. She had the surgery a few days after I was born, and the mass was benign. I was born on May 8th, 18 years to the day that Germany surrendered to Europe. 18, one of the most significant numbers to Jews, the symbol of life and good luck. And yes, today is obviously my birthday. There was a study done on Holocaust survivors that suggests that trauma that they suffered can actually alter their DNA. Epigenetic inheritance theorizes that external influences like stress can affect the genes of your children and even grandchildren. On May 8th, I became my parents' first child, Bubby's first grandchild, and possibly the recipient of environmentally altered DNA. As a mother, I know how all-consuming a newborn is, especially your first, when no matter how much you read or people tell you about it, you can't possibly imagine that these 6 pounds of terror will totally dominate your life. Now my mother had to navigate this and recover from major abdominal surgery. Bubby became a huge part of my upbringing. When she was interviewed for the Shoah Project, the first question she was asked was, "Why do you think that you survived?" And without missing a beat, she said, "Because God wanted me to." She lived long enough to see grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She was a shining example of what the human spirit can achieve. When she died in 2001, I was overcome with grief. But I carry her in my heart and my head every day. When I was young, I thought our family life was normal. My mother was living a life light years away from the Holocaust. She was a nurse, she got married, she had kids, she lived in a nice house. But she lacked the emotional and physical stamina to manage this life that she always wanted. I think it was having a child that probably tipped the scales for my mother. Making sure that I was physically safe dominated her psyche. And this anxiety turned to rage, frequently directed at my father and me. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family, but inside our pretty house, it was often chaos. My mother couldn't control her emotions. When she was angry at me, she would storm into my room in the middle of the night and yell at me. These episodes could happen several times a night and go on for months. Growing up with my mother was a little bit like having a chronically sick child in the family. The alignment was a little bit off. All of her energy tilted towards her. They were screaming and door slamming and weeping. But when she withdrew, shutting her bedroom door to daylight for hours, she held us hostage with her absence. We were like eggshell people tiptoeing, waiting for her to go off. As I grew up, the reasons for her tirades evolved. When I was 5 years old, my long stringy hair was too tangled and she couldn't corral it into a bun for ballet. At age 11, being at summer camp meant she couldn't stand to be separated from me for a month. At 13, my friends had too much influence over me and her control of me was ebbing away. And moving to Toronto at 20 was the ultimate rejection, which sparked a 3-year odyssey of fury. My mother used to call me a sociopath because I was not destroyed by her relentless campaigns. But I think her behavior actually made me stronger and more fearless. I had to stand up for myself, and I had to protect myself in order to be able to survive psychologically. My father was the polar opposite of my mother. He tried to calmly navigate our lifeboat while her fears and insecurities tried to capsize it. She was waving her arms, alerting us of dangers that may lie ahead, when in fact she was causing the storm. All my life, my father let me know that the world wasn't always terrifying and I deserved a place in it. One thing I have no doubt about is how much my parents loved each other. Yeah, there was turmoil, but they built a life that included culture, the synagogue, and an incredible group of friends, some of whom are here this evening. She was generous with her time. She sat on many charitable committees, and she helped people. My mother always said she was happiest when a snowstorm kept us trapped at home. Family vacations were a huge trigger for my mother. She had terrible travel anxiety. But one of the most difficult trips was Disney World when I was 12. She always hated crowds, but this was different. She complained about the long lines, being ushered and funneled this way and that. The near fascist efficiency of the happiest place on earth reminded her of Auschwitz. Significant family occasions were another lightning rod. Every celebration underscored loss. Everyone that should have been there but wasn't. At the time, I didn't really understand why my mother couldn't see these events as victories over where she came from. But I get it now, because at these family occasions, I also focus on the loss. When I got engaged to Michael, my boyfriend of 5 years, my mother swung into action. Within 48 hours, we had a date, a venue, a caterer, 2 bands, a photographer, and a videographer. My mother was very organized. And then the battles began over the wedding menu, the chinaware, and not surprisingly, the dress. I had found the perfect dress. It was very fitted, hugged my slim silhouette, and was covered in pearls and rhinestones like something Bob Mackie would have designed for Cher. I proudly emerged from the dressing room. She took one look at me and told me I looked like an emaciated concentration camp survivor. Like she so often did, my mother wore me down. Eventually, we decided on a gown, which is the one you see here, that was the epitome of 1980s overstatement. Italian lace, puffy sleeve, hundreds of buttons down the back, an exaggerated peplum, and of course, a royal length train. It was ridiculous. It had also been discontinued because no other bride would wear something that was so over the top. A few months later, my mother unveiled her dress, a form-fitting light blue sequin dress that Bob Mackie could have designed for Cher. I'm sure she never even realized how similar it was to the concentration camp dress. I waited until I was 3 months pregnant to tell my family. I was terrified of miscarrying in the first trimester. My first call was to my grandmother. She was so happy. I felt like this was the greatest gift I could give her. And then I called my mother. Dead silence on the other end. An added layer of anxiety. What if something happened to me or the baby? My daughter Lindsay was born in the middle of the night, but I waited until 6:30 a.m. to call my parents. They told me they would be there later that day with my grandmother. It was very important to me that my grandmother be there. We were now 4 generations of women who fought for this moment. This is a picture of my mother and Lindsay. You can see how much my mother loves Lindsay. This is one of my favorite pictures of my dad, also with Lindsay. And I included it because for anyone on this Zoom who knew my father, you know that this was who he was. There's my dad bringing it to my kids in my childhood bedroom with my psychedelic wallpaper. And we never missed an opportunity to take a picture of the 4 generations because we knew what a miracle that was. My mother was completely in love with Lindsay. Lindsay was interested in all the things my mother wanted to do. Teach her how to knit, bake, and go on excursions. This is them knitting in my parents' kitchen. Their favorite outing was to the flower show, a greenhouse down the street from my parents' house that I also loved as a child. Sometimes when I go to Montreal, I still go there and weep. I knew my 71-year-old mother was unraveling. We always spent Rosh Hashanah in Montreal, but that year, 2008, she forbade us from coming in. She finally relented when I promised we would stay in a hotel and I would arrange to have our meals catered. After dinner, I asked what time we should be back at the house the following day so we could all go to synagogue. My father looked at my mother, then at me, and declared that my mother wasn't going to synagogue. I did what I always did. I got mad at her. We had driven to Montreal, and now she refused to go. My mother was very calm, but she dug in. We left to go back to the hotel. The next morning, to my surprise, there she was in the kitchen, beautifully dressed and ready to go. And off we went, just like that. No explanation as to her bizarre behavior the night before. As we climbed the chairs to our seats, my mother stumbled and hurt her ankle. At first, I was concerned that it was something serious, but it turned out to be fine. In retrospect, I wish she'd broken it. Dinner that night was with Michael's family, but I left early so I could speak with my parents privately. I knew that they needed some sort of support system. My mother had stopped cooking, and I had no idea what they were eating. My father, now 76, was still working as a radiologist, and I worried that it was too much to be taking care of my mother as well. It was 9:30, but they were already in bed watching TV. I had a whole speech prepared. I'm worried. We need to get help around the house. You need to be on medication. My mother was strangely quiet. She didn't roll her eyes and yell at me over my dead body while some stranger come into my house like she usually did. She seemed to take it in, but she was sedate, a dimmer lamp on its lowest setting. I looked at my father to make sense of this unusual calm, but he didn't meet my gaze. I continued my how to get better speech until my father said quietly, "Your mother doesn't want to be here anymore." Did I take it seriously? No. In our family dynamic, my mother was always making dramatic pronouncements, so I ignored it. I kept talking about cooks and personal support workers and therapy. Because she was so calm, I thought she was taking it all in. And I was so sure I had gotten through to her, that they were going to finally let me step in and help. An unprecedented victory. And then I was done talking. It was late. I said goodnight and drove back to the hotel. The next morning, there we all were in the mudroom of their house, spilling out onto the back stoop to say goodbye before a trip to Toronto. My mother seemed calm, almost cheerful. Clearly, my bedside talk had gotten through to her. I had fixed everything. And I was so smug, I thought I was a superhero. My daughter Lindsay said goodbye, then my son Alex, then Michael, until it was just me standing in the doorway. I told my parents that I was going to the office when I got back to Toronto, so they shouldn't worry if I forgot to call. Calling upon arrival was a mandatory ritual to reassure my mother the catastrophe had not befallen us en route. My father turned to my mother. "See, Rachel, I'm just going to call you when she gets home." I thought it was an odd turn of phrase. What conversation between them had preceded it? There was no lingering embrace. We're not a family of huggers. And as we drove away, I turned back and waved. I don't know if they saw. I dropped Michael and the kids off at home and went to the office. I called my parents, no answer. The answering machine didn't pick up. That was odd. In between tasks, I kept calling, no answer. I called again, and then I called Michael and told him Michael said they'd probably gone for a walk. I called every 15 minutes, then I called Michael again, and he said maybe the phone service was down. I left the office at midnight, but by this time, I knew something terrible had happened. I assumed my father had had a heart attack, and my mother was too in shock to call us. I went home and painted my long nails blood red. I don't know why. It just seemed appropriate. I went to sleep at 1 a.m. with my cell phone next to my head. At 6:30 a.m., I started calling my parents again. Nothing. 7:30, I had my father paged at the hospital. He didn't pick up. I had Max Caillou, my Uncle Max, who had picked up my parents, paged, also no response. Michael took Alex to school. I got ready for work. And then I called Michael to tell him that I still couldn't reach my parents. And while I was telling that, he interrupted me. And he said, "Audrey, they're gone." I didn't really understand what he said. Gone. Where did they go? And then he said, "They're dead." I can't remember if Lindsay was with me when Michael told me, or she heard me screaming and ran in. She caught me as I collapsed to the floor. It's this moment in time where I felt like I left my body and watched this scene from above that I wish I could erase and spare Lindsay the horror of seeing me like that. After disaster, you look for signs everywhere. You lean close to the beats of each encounter that came before. You go sniffing through the past like a rescue dog in the rubble of an earthquake. But even if you find answers, they never feel like the right ones. We'll never actually know what happened. It was the milkman who called 911 on the morning of October 2nd. People accept that my mother made a conscious decision to end her lifelong pain and suffering, but no one believes that my father made the same choice. In a state of panic and confusion, did he see my mother rush in and accidentally close the garage door? Did he have a heart attack? Whatever happened, it likely occurred right after we left the day before. The breakfast dishes were still on the table. I now know that when someone makes a decision, a sense of calm can take over. My mother's change in demeanor was not because I had gotten through to her. This was the ripple eclipse, the tiny waves that emanated from my mother that now threatened to block out the light, especially for Lindsay and me. I made a promise to myself that day. This legacy stops here. No more secrets. Secrets kill. My life became bisected that day into before and after, like a steel door had slammed down, separating me from my past and forcing me to look at it through a new lens. I don't participate in Jewish holidays. I don't go to synagogue. I cut myself off from most of my parents' extended family. It was all just too painful. When we got to the house the next day, Michael tore the house apart looking for a note, but he never found one. What he did find on the TV stand of my parents' bedroom was a copy of the Jewish Book of Mourning. There was a specific paragraph underlined. I suspect this was my mother. She was always underlining paragraphs in books. The paragraph described what happens, what the mourning protocols are if someone passes away between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, the Day of Atonement, when your name is inscribed in the Book of Life. Perhaps that was why she was so reticent about going to synagogue. Maybe she knew her name would not be in that book. At the funeral, Lindsay sat beside me. She'd been glued to me for the last 2 days. When you lose one parent and the other parent is still alive, all the focus is on supporting the remaining parent. But in our case, we had leapfrogged. Suddenly, my 16-year-old daughter had to become my support system. To get to the graves, we had to walk up a hill. The weather was beautiful, and there was flowering bushes that dotted the cemetery, and they were still in full bloom. And then I got to the top of the hill. 2 caskets, 2, and a lot of dirt. And I froze. I couldn't take another step. A close friend noticed, stretched out his arm, and grabbed my hand, guiding me to my place beside the caskets. It is one of the most vivid memories I have of that day, the little kindnesses that mean so much. I felt untethered, in danger of floating away, and I made a deal with myself. You get 1 year to fall apart, then you rejoin the land of the living. And that's what I did. I dropped to 98 pounds. I drank constantly. I barely slept. I was essentially keeping myself in a semi-comatose state. But I still went to work every day because that was my mother's greatest gift to me, the art of compartmentalization. I too could make everything look okay to the outside world. But Lindsay was drifting away from us, falling into drugs, and the past was there, upending her present. I am a fighter like my mother, but our battles are different. She fought me like a caged animal most of my life, and she fought her own demons. She fought until she couldn't fight anymore, and that's where our paths split. Lindsay and I are still fighting back. Lindsay was adamant about going to university in Montreal, which I was really unhappy about. I hated going back there, but it was important to her. One of the first things she did when she got there was get a tattoo that said, "Be at peace." She hid it from me for a year, knowing that to me, tattoos symbolized the branding my mother and grandmother were subjected to. It took a long time for us to talk about what happened, both suffering in our silos. A year and a half ago, we bought a new house. All the boxes that had been moved from my parents' house to my old house had stayed sealed up until then for 14 years. I couldn't bear to look at the photos, but with this move, I forced myself to go through everything. And there were my parents, smiling and happy. But it was one picture specifically that struck me. They were at some gala event, my father dressed in a tux, my mother in a beautiful gown, looking at each other with so much love. No indication of the chaos that sometimes whirled behind the scenes. A perfect moment in time. If you're lucky, the trauma walks beside you, a constant companion. And if you're not, it overtakes you. It's said that you die twice. Once when you stop breathing, and a second time when someone says your name out loud for the last time. I choose not to let them die a second time. Aaron Greenspan, Jack Simberg, Regina Simberg, Bram Hyams, Rachel Hyams. Thank you.
Audrey, thank you so much for your courage in sharing this very difficult personal story. It's a privilege to have this time with you today. And it's also a privilege to have the opportunity to dive even a little bit deeper into your story. So thank you for this opportunity today. I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please do send them directly in the chat box. We will have time to get to those. I'm going to start with a few myself, if that's okay. And I want to go back to where you started the story, which is, of course, your mother and grandmother's survival in the Holocaust. You said that you learned your mother was a Holocaust survivor at the age of 7, the same age when she received her Auschwitz tattoo. And of course, you shared some detailed information about their survival in your presentation. Did you have to search for traces of this family history? How much did your mother and grandmother share about their survival experience?
My mother shared very little. My grandmother shared some, more than my mother, but I knew so little about it, and there was really a progression of getting that information. So my mother participated in the book Kinderlager, and it was really the first time that I learned a lot of her story. And I have to tell you that when I got the book and I started reading her chapter, that story about the possibility of them all deciding to commit suicide when they knew that they were going to be sent to Auschwitz, I stopped reading the book, and it's pretty soon into her portion of the book. And then I didn't read it. I didn't read it until I started working on this memoir. But it's been an interesting journey because I've crossed paths with people now who have shared information with me that I didn't know before. And one of the other women who was featured in Kinderlager wrote a book that came out last year called The Daughter of Auschwitz, and that was written by Toba Friedman. And Malcolm Brabant, who is based in the UK and co-wrote the book with her, actually became a tremendous resource for me because he was so familiar with Toba's story, and there was so much overlap between Toba's story and my story that he was able to share some things with me. And I also ended up getting in contact, and the timing was just very strange. There was a woman in Poland who was writing a book called The Children of Tomaszów. And so she also started filling in some gaps for me. But I guess the short form answer is it really wasn't something that we talked a lot about at all.
So part of that cone of silence and that silence that kills, keeping that, yeah. Incredible. And I'm sure so many questions that you have and that you wish you could have answers to that unfortunately probably never will. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think, the phrase, there's nobody left to ask, comes up in my mind a lot.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned, of course, this incredible relationship that you had with your grandmother, your Bobby. You said she was such a huge part of your upbringing. But you also said that you think that had a lot to do with your mother not being able to cope. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I think it was just a lot. I mean, anyone who's been a young mother knows what the situation is. So I think she was there as a support system, but I think the other part of it was too, is that my grandmother wanted to be there all the time. I mean, it was such a miracle that this had happened. And also, don't forget that she'd just been widowed. So I was born in 63 and my grandmother was widowed in 61. And she, I hope I've conveyed what her spirit was like, but one of the things that always amazed me about her is, if we would go grocery shopping together, and we would be lined up at Steinberg's, which Montrealers will remember, by the time we left the line, my grandmother already had like 5 friends, like the woman in front of her she was talking to, the woman behind her that she was talking to. And she was such a guiding force for me, because she was such she was such a tribute to survival, and because obviously she must have had her own demons too, but I didn't see them, and she died, at 86. So she was in my life, for a long time. And in fact, it's a whole other story, but she landed up living in Toronto when I was living in Toronto, and she got married for a 3rd time. And so I spent a lot of time with her, and her greatest joy was stuffing me so full of food that, by the time I got home, I could barely move. So I was able to spend that time with her that no one else got when, she was still relatively healthy, and I knew the man that she married as well. And so it was wonderful to be able to spend that time with them.
Yeah, what a precious relationship to have. You of course mentioned as well, your dad, and that you were both recipients of your mother's rage together. What did that do for your relationship with your dad? I can only imagine it must have been a strong relationship, a special relationship with him.
My father, I think, was in a really difficult position. because, you know, obviously he wanted to support my mother, but I think he also felt the need to protect me. And my father had a very different outlook about life. He wasn't scared of everything, you know, like my mother was. And he really, you know, he fought for things. He came from a well-known family in Montreal, and he became a doctor when there were Jewish quotas. And he trained as a surgeon. And then at some point after he was a surgeon and had a thriving practice, he decided he didn't want to be a surgeon anymore. And he went back and he trained as a radiologist. But you know, the message that my father disseminated to me was, you have a good head on your shoulders and you've been given a good start to life. And so, you know, I trust you and I trust your judgment. And, you know, I did go to him, like when I started working and was floundering, and he always gave me great advice, you know, and he said, just work hard and people will notice, and that'll get you somewhere. And he did. He was very pragmatic. But he was also the nicest, kindest man. And that wasn't just to us, you know, that was to a very large extended circle of friends. And, you know, to be honest, obviously my relationship with my mother was complicated. But losing my father is still incredibly difficult for me. And, you know, the pictures that I didn't look at for a long time was because I couldn't look at the pictures of my father. And, you know, that picture that I showed with Lindsay, you know, that was just who my father was. And that wound is still pretty open.
There's some great questions that are coming in the chat box. So I'm actually I'm gonna jump to a few of those and kind of go back and forth between ones that we chatted about and pull some from the chat box. First of all, you have some lovely comments. Audrey coming in, just thanking you so much for recounting the story. You have people saying they're very proud of you. So I'm assuming you have a connection to some of these people. And again, just how moved people are that you're willing to share this. One of the questions is, how has this impacted your day-to-day life now? And what are your fears?
You know, I think when you go through this kind of trauma, I mean, as I said, in that first year, it was difficult, and I was basically in a coma. Now it's different for me now because I've started this project. So, you know, what I've been saying to people I'm close to is, I've been spending a lot of time with my parents recently. And that's really how I feel, because I kept myself so separated from them, you know, for all those years. So, you know, it's an interesting journey to go through. And, you know, when you're writing this type of memoir, that's kind of difficult subject matter, people will say, you know, you better take care of yourself. You know, this is dangerous and this can be scary. But to be honest, I think I've lived through the evolution of my family for my whole life. And so, you know, I think I'm doing okay, but I do really, you know, it's not just words. You know, when I was talking about trauma, walking beside you, I think it always walks beside you. And, you know, yes, pain changes and it evolves over time. But, you know, I have a good friend who says some things are so big that they're forever things. And this is one of the forever things.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I feel like the writing must be therapeutic almost in a way too. Is it fair to say that to be able to work through some of that too, or?
You know, I think, if I'm being honest, I don't actually find it therapeutic. I don't know why. I think I'm just very laser focused, and when I set my mind to something, then I do it, and that's sort of the journey. So, and it's still in progress, so maybe I'll feel that way at the end. And it's interesting, right? It's interesting to be 15 years out of since they died, and also my mother's history, and still to be learning new things. So, you know, and some of those things are great and some of those things are difficult. So, that's a journey too. You know, I like a predictable environment, and some of the stuff that's coming up isn't predictable.
Someone asked as well if you've forgiven your parents.
Well, that entails that I feel like my parents needed something to be forgiven for, and I don't feel that way. And I'll tell you why, and there's a few reasons why. One, when someone makes a decision, in my opinion, I'm not putting this on anyone else, but when someone makes a decision like that, it's because they truly believe that in whatever confused state that they're in, that makes the most sense to them. And I think when people look at this type of situation, everyone says, well, how could they do that? You know, how could they do that to their children? And I never looked at it that way. I looked at it that my mother was in a lot of pain. And this decision made sense for her. I think she thought everybody was better off without her. My situation, obviously, because of what happened with my father, is incredibly complicated. But you know, I think there's another tangent to this too, which maybe this question is going to come up, which is, you know, do I feel guilty, right? Because I shared that I was sort of given this forewarning, and I didn't do anything about it, and I really felt that guilt was going to be a useless emotion, because I guess I'm the only person who could know this, but if I had any inkling that this was actually something that was going to happen, obviously I would have acted differently. So my parents don't need to be forgiven, because I'm not angry at them. And I thought guilt and anger were going to be very destructive. I was in enough trouble. I was sinking enough, and I thought that's not going to help me. So I don't know how, you know, other people who are in the situations, but for me, it wasn't about that.
Yeah, I think you offer a really unique perspective in talking about this for sure. Someone else was asking, you focus a lot on your daughter in your story. Is that because it was different with your son?
I think I mean, my kids were 16 and 14 when it happened, and they're different people. My son is sitting here, and my daughter is on the Zoom. So I'm incredibly proud of both of my children, and I think, you know, in this journey of trying not to be angry and trying to go forward, and trying to be more grateful has become a much more important part of my lexicon than it has before. Lindsay was 16, and I think it happened to her at a pivotal time in her life. And my son is a different personality than my daughter. And I also think that Lindsay felt this responsibility to try to take care of me. And I think the other issue is that Lindsay was, you know, she had this really special relationship with my mother because she was 16, right? She was not a fully formed human, but she was a pretty formed human. And they had this amazing relationship. And that made it incredibly difficult because she had that relationship. And I'll share a story. So obviously there was a lot of going back and forth between Montreal and Toronto, and having to deal with my parents' estate, and they had a house. And when the house sold and I had to go back to go through everything, and I was like a total wreck. This was about 7 months after they died, and you know, I had a bottle of scotch with me the entire time, and that's what I did. I got through the whole thing by, you know, drinking. I'm not an alcoholic, by the way, never have been, just that period was difficult. And my daughter calls me and she says, I want to come see the house before it sells. And I was such a mess, and I thought, I can't, like, it's too much pain, and it's too much pain to have her there. And I said no, and she was very angry with me. And then my husband called me and said, you have to let her do it. And so I did. So I let her do it. And, you know, we still talk about it, not all the time. It took a long time. I think that Lindsay thought that if she talked to me about it, it was gonna rip the wound open more. And so she didn't do that. But she, like I said, she was suffering in her silo too. And I also just want to say that, you know, my daughter has had her struggles, and she's a very incredible, you know, person, and I'm very proud of her. And I just want to give a shout out to her because I know she's here, and I love you, sweetie.
Can I, and if it's too, please, if you're not comfortable answering, please let me know. But you mentioned how both you and Lindsay fought back, and that this was a very conscious choice to fight back. Can you talk about a little bit more about both of your journeys in fighting back? What has that looked like, and what does that mean? I guess a little bit more.
I think, I mean, we both did a lot of therapy, that's for sure. I started therapy when Lindsay was 6 weeks old, because I was kind of terrified that I was ill-equipped to be a mother. And I knew that, there were things about my mother as a role model that I didn't want to replicate. And so, I went to therapy right away. So that was helpful. But I think both Lindsay and I had very strong support networks around us. And we're both very focused and hardworking. And, I can't understate compartmentalization. And I don't know what, therapists would say, and if that's healthy or it's not healthy, but that was the way I survived. I can't speak for Lindsay. I'm not sure if it was the same thing for her. But everything was in a silo. And then I also had this trick where, sometimes the thoughts and the demons were really coming down on me, and I just felt like I couldn't deal with it at that moment. And so I used this visualization theory where I actually pictured myself, pushing them away. And I would say, not now, I can't talk to you, not now. So, that was one of the coping mechanisms I had. And, there was a weird thing that I went through too, that whenever there was big crowds, even though I know this is metaphysically impossible, I thought, oh, I'm gonna see my parents in this crowd. Like somehow there's gonna be some sort of time warp or space vortex, and I'm gonna see my parents again. And obviously, I know it's not reasonable, but every time there were big crowds, I just thought, well, maybe they're there.
And that was a comfort to think that maybe they would be there.
No, it was probably more scary. It's interesting too that I don't remember a lot of my dreams. I think my psyche has really blocked out a lot of that. And I know people like seeing, people who've passed away, their good dreams and stuff like that. And I haven't really had any. I had a really terrifying one about my mother a few months after they passed away. And I don't have a lot of other ones. So I don't have that. I envy people sometimes who have these dreams where, they have these beautiful interactions and they wake up and they feel so good. And I don't have that.
No. How do you think your growing up experience has impacted your parenting? I know that that's a difficult question to answer, because this is who you are, that's your experience, that's what it brought to you. But have you spent time thinking about how this has impacted your parenting?
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, I started therapy, and really it was because, my mother, in some things that I read that she wrote, talked about how she felt very ill-equipped to be a mother, because look at what her childhood was, right? And there was no siblings, and her mother was not a role model in the traditional sense, and there was not really cousins, and there weren't other people. There was no one on that side of the family, at least in Montreal. And so she felt like she was really lost. And I felt that way too, because I thought, this is not the type of mother I want to be. I don't want to be scared about my children's physical safety all the time. I mean, I think everyone is, but I think that was more exaggerated. And it was really about the need to control, right? Because I'm a pretty big control freak. And, my daughter would probably say, I was too controlling. My son would probably say that too. But believe me, I was much less controlling than I wanted to be. I remember having a funny exchange with Lindsay, and this was not all that long ago. And I was talking about how I was such an overprotective mother. And, I said to Lindsay, right? She goes, yeah, until Nana and Papa died, and then you didn't care anymore, and you let us do whatever we wanted. So, and it was a really interesting revelation, because I didn't realize that. I still thought I was an involved parent. I don't really now know how I could have thought I was an involved parent if I was sleeping about 2 hours a night and, you know, walking, you know, the walking wounded, but it was very funny when she told me that.
Different perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned intergenerational trauma, of course, and that's, you know, such a huge part of your experience and the writing that you're doing now. Any advice for anyone who's, you know, trying to grapple with this in their own lives? Any suggestions that you can offer for people to address?
You know, one of the, you know, tenets in my life, which happened, I mean, it happened before my parents died, but you have to find people that you can speak to and that you can be honest with. And that doesn't, I'm not suggesting that you run around telling everybody what your problems are and all that sort of thing. And therapy, you know, obviously is one potential avenue, but if you're lucky to have people in your life who understand you and, you know, finding people who are like-minded, so whether that's, you know, finding groups or something like that, I think has been the most helpful. You know, to me, there were people that the people that stood by me in that year saved my life. And, you know, I'll just share this because I think it's an important message and because she's sitting in the next room. But I've had a girlfriend since I was born. Our parents knew each other. We ended up living across the street from each other. Her name is Naomi Cohn. And when I was in trouble and I knew that I was in trouble, I went to her and I said, "You're my gatekeeper. You're going to be the only one that I listen to, and I trust you to tell me. So if I get too skinny, if I'm acting out, if I'm drinking too much, you know, then you have to be the one to tell me." So I think it's important to try to seek people within your network if you're lucky enough to have that. And if not, try to find, I mean, there's lots of ways through social media, you know, to find those people. But I think not everyone's comfortable talking about their experiences. And I get that and I respect that, but I don't think it's helpful to hold it in. So try to find someone you can talk to.
Yeah, that community of support.
Yeah.
To know that you're not going, you know, it's a unique experience, but you're not alone.
You're not the only one, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. How I know that your son is sitting next to you and your daughter's on the call and you've got lots of, you know, support, certainly on this call. How have they responded to you opening up and, you know, sharing this very vulnerable part of yourself and this family testimony?
Well, you know, Lindsay obviously had to be a big part of it. And I've interviewed her for the book and, you know, I spoke to her today because I've been checking with her every day, you know, like, do you want to read it? Do you want to hear what I'm saying? And she said, you know, "I trust you, Mom. And, even if I don't agree with you, I know that it's your truth." And Lindsay, you know, really believes in that part of it. But I also think that, you know, pain is a very personal journey and sharing your pain isn't something that everybody wants to do, and that's fine. And I didn't publicly, you know, for 15 years. And, you know, I've been in touch with a lot of people who've reached out to me, people from high school, and even some of my best friends from high school who I know are also on this Zoom said like they had no idea what was going on, you know, in my house. There were so few people that actually knew what was going on because we had, you know, this pretty facade, and we could, you know, we could carry it off in public. We did that very well.
Do you want to talk a bit about your book? Have you got a release date or is there information you can share with us about how to?
It's still in
Yeah.
process, so
Still in
you
process.
can't, there's nothing yet, but I'll keep you informed about it. And really, I think, you know, I don't read very many Holocaust books. I stopped. I had an unfortunate experience when Sophie's Choice came out, and I went to see that movie, which I didn't know what it was about. And then when they get to the end of the movie, you know, like honestly, like the expression I've used it like I was catatonic after that. I couldn't speak. So after that, it was no Holocaust movies, no Holocaust books or anything like that. But I think what differs with this story is, first of all, it's about 4 generations of women, which you sort of need to have, the moments in time have lined up that there could be 4 generations of women who actually met each other. So that's sort of incredible. And I'm more interested, I would say more interested, but I think the journey after is important. And I know that there's a lot of books that have detailed people's experiences and stuff like that. And that's not necessarily what I'm interested in. And I also think that even though the Holocaust is the backdrop of it, and that's what the source of trauma was, there's a lot of grief and trauma that people go through. And to me, it's important to sort of share that story. And it helps, right? It helps interacting, as I said earlier, it helps interacting with people who've been through difficult circumstances. So I hope to be able to help other people, and not necessarily just within the Holocaust rubric.
Yeah, I'll speak just from the Holocaust education perspective. I think for so long we focused on, the experience during the Holocaust, and then liberation, and everything was wonderful because everyone was free.
Yeah.
And we know that yes, that was an incredible moment in time, but there's a lot of, what does that rebuilding look like? What do lives look like after, when you've lost everything? And so I think, again, part of the incredibly compelling part of your narrative in this story, and how important it is that it's filling a gap of an area that hasn't been explored enough, and that, maybe people outside of, that lived experience don't have an understanding. And it's very important. And as you mentioned, the connectivity of it as well with other groups who have gone through intergenerational trauma. We did have another question come in here just asking, how common do you think this story is with Holocaust survivors? Do you think your story is a common story amongst others?
You mean the children of Holocaust survivors?
Children of survivors, yes.
It's interesting because I do have a fair number of children of Holocaust survivors in my life, 2 in particular who are very important. And some of the experiences are similar, and some of them aren't. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because, people who don't want to necessarily go public about their stuff. But what I would say is we've all been affected in one way or another, but it's not necessarily in the same way. So in my household, there was a tremendous amount of control that my mother, wanted over me. But in other households that I've spoken to, their mother was completely different. They were go ahead and run wild. And I don't know if that was because they just couldn't cope with everything, or whatever. So, I mean, I think there's some similarities, but I don't think it's a uniform experience. I think you can't say intergenerational trauma caused by the Holocaust, these are the hallmarks that are going to affect every child. But I would hazard to say every child has been affected by it.
Hmm. One of the challenges in looking for those signs and symptoms is that it is such a unique experience. But I know that there's some fascinating research that's being done in intergenerational trauma, and I'm sure much more that we'll learn. And I'm sure the work that you're doing is certainly going to contribute to that. We are coming to the end of our time together today. Again, Audrey, thank you so much for your courage to speak, your willingness to share your experience with us. You're a compelling speaker, and we're just so grateful for your time today. I'm just wondering, I want to give you space for, kind of closing words before I thank everyone for coming today. A message that you want people to leave our time together today with.
I guess the message is that, even if you're scared to face things, try to do that, and try to find people that can face them with you, because living in your own little box and trying to figure out everything for yourself isn't something that always is such a great thing. And, not everyone is going to be happy to help you. Oh, am I still there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But try to find those people in your life that are going to be there to help you, and and rely on them and be there for them, because that's what's important. You know, I've always said, for a lot of reasons and a lot of difficult times that we've gone through, that you know, friendships are not based on the good times. Friendships are based on the bad times. And so, you know, if you're lucky enough, try to do that, and don't suffer alone. You know, it doesn't end well.
Yeah. Powerful words to carry us through the evening. Thank you so much, Audrey. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, the comments coming in are very much words of thanks, and again, commending you for sharing this with everyone today.